Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Free Press Live. It's been a shattering 24 hours here for the free press and for America, for anyone that loves and cares about this country. And that's because yesterday, in broad daylight, in front of a crowd of thousands of people at Utah Valley University, Charlie Kirk was shot dead. As our columnist Matt Continetti wrote, the assassination of Charlie Kirk is shocking on every level. He was shot in public, in front of a large crowd, and on video. The 31-year-old husband and father of two was not an elected official, but was the most successful conservative activist in a generation. The attack didn't just deprive a family of its center, it struck at the ties that hold a free society together: open assembly, civil debate, viewpoint diversity. Like every terrorist act, the shooting was meant to instill fear. In this case, fear of speaking out, fear of exposure, fear of making a difference. In other words, this isn't just another case of senseless gun violence, though of course it's that too. It is a political assassination, or at least it appears to be. That's one of the things we're going to discuss today, that I believe signals a complete change in the tenor of our country. I think this is a watershed event. It signals a new era in our political culture, one in which violence is increasingly embraced as a way to solve debate rather than words, which is what Charlie Kirk tried so hard to do. So today, and over the next hour and a bit, I am so excited to be joined by some of the brightest minds on this and so many other issues. They include Matt Continetti, Catherine Boyle, Konstantin Kisin, Senator Mark Kelly, and the Free Press's own Maya Sulkin, Eli Lake, and Peter Savodnik. But first, I'm going to be joined by Ben Shapiro. He is, of course, the founder of the Daily Wire and the host of the Ben Shapiro Show. He met Charlie Kirk 13 years ago when Charlie was just 18 years old. Ben, thank you so much for joining me.
And thanks, Barry. I appreciate it.
Ben, you met Charlie, as you write about in a piece for the Free Press, when he was just 18 years old. And can you just give us a sense of your first impression of him? Who was that guy that you met when he was still a teenager?
One of the things that we say at Daily Wire is that you can't teach grit. Charlie was just gritty from the start. What I mean by that is that Charlie just had endless energy, boundless enthusiasm. When I first met Charlie, he was walking around a David Horowitz Freedom Center event over at the Breakers in West Palm Beach, and he was trying to meet donors. And so I started introducing him to some of his original donors. He already had kind of started the organization. It was pretty small. And Charlie was just a go-getter. I mean, from the beginning, he was a go-getter. And one of the things that is amazing about Charlie as a human being and doing what he did is that I watched Charlie get better at pretty much everything over the course of his adult life. When you meet him at 18, Charlie's a gangly kid. He was fresh out of high school. He wasn't going to college. And he thought, okay, here's a kid who's not going to college and he's starting a political organization. Good luck. But when I first met him, within an hour, I turned to Jeremy Boring and I said to Jeremy, that kid's going to be the head of the RNC. Like he was clearly on that path. There's just no doubt about it. And the thing about Charlie is that despite, the kind of original awkwardness, when he was 18, he's kind of awkward. He turned himself into a very charismatic speaker. He turned himself into a really terrific debater. He became much more religious, I think, over the course of his adult life. He got married. He had a couple of kids. And so I had a chance, a real opportunity from God to watch Charlie develop over the course of 13 years. And I don't consider, myself to be one of Charlie's closest friends. I wasn't. I'd probably be in like his third circle. But that's the thing about Charlie is that everybody who knew him and had dealings with him had good relations with Charlie. Charlie was extremely warm, really gregarious. It's a sickening thing to have to talk about a 31-year-old man with kids who are 3 and 1 in the past tense. I mean, Charlie is one of the most energetic, alive people that I've ever met in my life. And that was one of the reasons that I knew that he was going to be incredibly successful at what he chose to do, is because that energy never flagged until the minute a bullet took it from him.
So you sort of thought that his ceiling was going to be the head of the RNC, but he became so much more than that. For people, and it's funny, we live in such a balkanized world. I was at an event last night and some people there were sad that a person had been killed, a father had been killed, but they really had little idea of who Charlie Kirk was and what he meant to people and what he meant to young conservatives in the movement that you both share. Can you explain sort of what Turning Point USA is and who Charlie Kirk was, what he meant to so many young people?
So, I mean, when I said he was the head of he'd be the head of the RNC, again, that was 13 years ago when the RNC actually meant something. And the RNC has basically withered as an institution, and it was basically replaced by TPUSA. TPUSA is what the RNC kind of once was. It's a gigantic get out the vote machine that's largely responsible for President Trump's massive uptick in the last election cycle with young people. It's a huge social media machine. Charlie was extremely popular and famous with young people, specifically because of the things he was doing on college campuses. All these clips that are blanketing social media today, but that a lot of us on the right have, of course, seen for years of Charlie debating people, going out into crowds and actually meeting people. His events were enormous and are enormous. I mean, if you ever go to a TPUSA event, you're talking now, the big events, these gigantic weekends, like 15, 20,000 people at these events. Charlie he turned himself into a rock star. And again, that was an awkward fit for Charlie at the beginning. If you look at what he was trying to do with TPUSA, he was trying to find people who were sort of naturally charismatic and great on TV and put those people in front of crowds that he would build. And then eventually he realized that he really needed to do it himself. And so he, I think, has an enormous following, probably the biggest following among people below the age of 30 on the right and maybe in the center of the country, specifically because of his fluency with social media, his ability to actually have these tete-a-tetes with people in person, and his ability to get out of crowd. I mean, there's a reason 3,000 people showed up in the middle of a day, in a weekday, in Utah to see Charlie just talk to people in a conversation that was going to be caught on camera. I mean, that was the setting that he was in the middle of when an evil monster shot him in the neck and killed him.
We're going to get to that evil monster in a second and what we know so far. I want to talk a little bit about the broader context in which this has happened, because, this has been one of the darkest weeks that I can remember. I feel a level of sadness that I'm not used to feeling, not just because of the murder of Charlie Kirk, but also because of the story of Irina out of Charlotte and what happened on that light rail train when she was stabbed in the neck. And there's just this feeling of sort of rising tide of darkness. And here's how you put it. A wave of violence is building from the assassination of Charlie Kirk to the attempted shooting of President Trump, from the murder of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson to the slaying of 2 Israeli embassy staffers. All of these acts of extreme violence have found support in the dark precincts of political radicals. The temperature in our country has steadily been rising, you write, and it's been rising because many people have determined that their political opponents are not just opponents, but enemies, threats to their very existence. That determination by fringe actors is often reinforced in the online spaces that prize virality and mirror emotional excess, and then it breaks free from the world of the online into real life with bloody and horrific consequences. Last part. Yes, that phenomenon crosses the political aisle, but to pretend that the phenomenon is distributed equally would be a mistake. Pick it up from there. Why would that be a mistake? Tell us about what we know. The shooter is still at large in the case of Charlie Kirk, but they've picked up some ammunition that indicates his ideology.
So, I mean, first of all, I think that regardless of who the shooter is, the reaction online tells a large part of the story. The death of Charlie Kirk was met by most mainstream political actors with horror, obviously, as it should be. But on Blue Sky, obviously there's tremendous celebration of Charlie's death. On TikTok, tremendous celebration of Charlie's death. Follow-on threats to other political people, ranging from me to J.K. Rowling to Matt Walsh, to a wide variety of political actors who are seen as aligned with Charlie. And so the reaction, I think, is in and of itself telling. Social media fosters this sort of stuff. The algorithms promote this sort of stuff. They give fringe actors a feeling of solidarity and a feeling there's an audience watching them do these sorts of things. But what we know about the shooter at this point, while limited, I mean, the FBI has released pictures of who they believe, I think, to be the shooter. And they're now they're offering a $100,000 reward for information on the shooter. This is obviously well thought out. The shooter took one shot and fled via presumably a pre-existing route to get away and broaden the radius of search. What they found is the rifle that was used to shoot Charlie. They found the expended cartridge in the gun and 3 other bullets that were nearby, all apparently etched with trans and Antifa laden messaging. That is not a shock. It really is not. I mean, my first reaction when I heard that Charlie had been shot, other than I couldn't believe that it was true, because again, Bari, you do this for a living. I do this for a living. We speak in public places, speak on college campuses, and I'm the kind of person where, I've had experiences when I was at Berkeley. They had to have 500 police officers back in 2017. So, and people would say, it's brave of you to be there. And it never occurred to me that was brave, because it's not. It shouldn't be.
Well,
In
it shouldn't
America, you
be.
don't get shot. You don't get shot for saying things that people disagree with in America. And it never occurred to me that that was a reality. I always thought that it was just overblown by my security team or by people who are sort of exaggerating online. It was not a shock at all, because one of the things I think we need to focus on when it comes to the politics of this is that there are certain conspiratorial ideas about the world that create permission structures for violence. And that is really, really important. Not all political ideologies are built toward that sort of permission structure of violence. Differences on, for example, marginal income tax rates are not going to lead to people being assassinated. They just won't, because nobody is making the case that if you raise or lower the marginal tax rate, this is going to result in the death of a loved one. There are ideologies out there, and the trans Antifa ideology is one of these ideologies that effectively suggests that if you deny my preferred view of the world, you're erasing me. You're engaging in what's called a trans genocide. You're destroying me as a human being, and you are thus a threat to me. So speech is a form of violence, and violence is to be met with violence. And you've seen this sort of ideology being promoted on college campuses to excess for a decade at least. I mean, for a very, very long time. You've seen it in a lot of these college protests where violence is excused. You saw it with Luigi Mangione, because the language there was that, after all, Brian Thompson, who was the victim in that particular case, must have been the perpetrator, since he was taking part in a system that was directly responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. And that sort of rhetoric was not just uttered by fringe actors. I mean, comedian Bill Burr literally said that. I mean, so that sort of burgeoning permission structure, it doesn't mean that those people are directly responsible for violence. Only a shooter is directly responsible for violence. But people are responsible for the words that come out of their mouth and the permission structures that they build. And not all ideologies are equally susceptible to those permission structures.
One of my producers saw a post from an acquaintance who wrote online, "I'm allowed to be thankful that this asshole of a human being has vacated the planet." And you see just basically people going, that there's a spectrum of sort of literally reveling in death and murder, to this feeling of, well, he kind of had it coming. He's kind of reaping the whirlwind. He's reaping what he sowed. How can we contend with that? For people that are watching this, and like this describes Free Press subscribers, we are people who, thought that the country was better when you could disagree with people without disliking them, think that it is completely normal to sit in a newsroom with people who vote or think differently from you on the most hot button issues in politics and culture, and still get a beer at the end of the day. For people that are watching this, that want to stand up for that version of America, the thing that we used to call normal, what can be done about it? Because I think a lot of people are feeling just tremendous despair. You look online at some of this reaction, I have to say, I've been really heartened. There's an excellent column that Ezra Klein wrote that I highly recommend people go and read. A lot of the people that have huge platforms have been really responsible. So I want to for sure say that. But there's an element of just glee and as you're saying, a sense that Charlie Kirk was somehow a legitimate target because of his views. How do we step back from the brink? How do we turn down the temperature? What can be done both by people that are in the public square and just ordinary citizens who want to live in a country where setting up a tent saying, "Come argue with me," is something that is not just safe, but celebrated? What can they do?
I mean, I think the first thing we can do is actually engage in some of those debates ourselves, actually talk with people on the other side of the aisle and recognize that person is not somebody who actually wants to kill you or erase you, that they're a person who has a different viewpoint. And that's kind of gone the way of the dodo bird in the modern social media era, where an enormous number of these people are doing this for the likes. They're doing it for the virality, doing it for the clicks. They believe there's a sort of mob waiting for action for them to activate. And a great way to get attention is by doing this sort of stuff. So touching grass is definitely a big one. But I think that we are also going to have to examine the structure of a lot of our institutions. I mean, how social media works is a disaster area. It fully is a disaster area. There's no question. It's making the world a worse place. And that's not a call for censorship. But I will say that I think that social media sites where you're going to get fed video, this happened yesterday all over X, where the settings are such that you're getting fed video of a man's death literally every 3 posts all day long. extremely graphic, bloody. That is something that should not be. And people, in positions of power over these outlets ought to be responsible for that. They ought to do something about that, because I think we can all agree that videos of Charlie Kirk bleeding out on camera, what that his kids and wife are going to say is that's not something that we should be promoting. I think the other thing that needs to happen is we really ought to examine our own political priors and our own political viewpoints to find, again, those systems that suggest a permission structure for violence. I think that it's very easy for people to slip into, you see this a lot, and this is a bipartisan problem. You see people a lot slip into the third person plural without specifying exactly who they mean. And I've said many times that specificity is the enemy of violence and the enemy of
Meaning
conflict.
like they're out to get us, like that?
Yes. Yeah, they did it. They shot Charlie. A very specific person shot Charlie. We're going to find out who that was. I have a feeling, and I think from the available evidence, a very specific ideological strain created the permission structure for that, and we should call that out, examine it, and figure out how to stop that. I think that the sort of generalization beyond what the evidence is capable of holding, or the attempt to apply that rule to everybody on quote unquote the other side, is one of the reasons why Charlie is dead. I think that you see this all the time. I'll speak from sort of the right wing perspective, the conservative perspective, about how many people on the left see the right, which is as a sort of flat circle in which everybody is equivalent. And so anybody who associates with President Trump or voted for President Trump is a member of a Hitlerian group and is thus fair game. That sort of generalization is not only unwarranted and stupid, it is actually dangerous. And Charlie Kirk was about as mainstream a conservative as it is possible to find. Listen, we're in a country where nobody should be executed in broad daylight for their views. That is one of the foundational points of America. But if you are talking about the uptick in violence that is going to lead to bad actors going out and shooting people, then we do have to call out the fact that the portrayal, this is where President Trump was right last night, when the portrayal of people like Charlie Kirk as a Nazi, as somebody who's an incipient threat to the very foundational freedoms of the republic, that is dangerous stuff. That is dangerous stuff. And it really does need to stop. And I do not think that it is equally stacked. I think there are people on the right who do that. And I think it's wrong when people on the right do that. But I think that it is overwhelmingly right now a phenomenon of the left. And perhaps that's a reflection of the fact that President Trump was reelected and the people in power are people that people on the left don't like very much. And so the rhetoric gets more and more, kind of fringe. But the sort of analogy that I've been using for a long time on my show when it comes to rhetoric is that, again, only violent people are responsible for their violent actions unless they are, there's an actual incitement crime. But if you think of the American body politic as a pot of water, and rhetoric is the flame beneath the pot of water, if you keep turning up that heat, you will get bubbling over. And that bubbling over is going to get worse and worse. And I do think that we've reached a sort of watershed moment, as you mentioned up top. But what happened to Charlie is unique. This is not just a random act of violence like we saw on that Charlotte light rail. This is not, it was a targeted assassination. This is not just a targeted assassination of even a political figure like President Trump. I think one of the things that's stunning people today is the kind of emotional gut level understanding that even an assassination attempt against the former president and current president, Donald Trump, was closer to a sort of evil and horrifying normal of life than the assassination of a person who literally just went on campus to talk to people about politics without running for office, without being in charge of the levers of public policy or anything like that. It's much more, again, like Brian Thompson being shot on the streets of New York. And it's even worse than that because Brian Thompson, was not engaged in free speech at the time. I mean, what's going to make Charlie correctly a free speech martyr? And the reason they're going to build statues to Charlie is because he was literally in the middle of using words to talk about vital issues when he was shot to death. I mean, he literally died doing the thing that America is supposed to be about. And that's whenever I'm saying this to friends and family about Charlie, like I knew Charlie pretty well. And Bari, obviously, you've known a lot of high-profile political figures. And when you know high-profile political figures pretty well, everybody is shaded, everybody is rounded, everybody's got their strengths and their flaws. And when something like this happens, then immediately history gets compressed and flattened. And you come away with kind of the one-dimensional view of who the person was. In some cases, that's for bad. For Charlie, I think what's going to shine through, the thing that's going to make Charlie's memory mean something, is the fact that he was engaged in a debate about vital public policy when he was shot to death on a college campus. By the way, this says something about our college campuses. There is a rising tide on our college campuses of young people who believe that violence is a proper solution to speech I don't like.
Ben,
which is why, people like Charlie Charlie had a 6-man security team there. He did. I mean, I know his security team. my security was dealing directly with his security team yesterday. Like this is, we all have security now, right?
Right, so that's the thing. It's no amount of body men around him could have stopped a guy shooting. I mean, sure, you could build a bulletproof box around a person. How does this change the way? What is the chilling effect that you think this has on, candidly, people like you, who are, the things that are being said right now about you online are horrifying? And the amount of security you've required, as you mentioned, for a long time. I remember that 2017 in Berkeley. I think I wrote about it for the New York Times. And you've written in your piece that as much as your security team, told you to wear bulletproof vests, insisted on metal detectors, you never felt unsafe, because to accept that you were unsafe, and this is what you write, would be to consider that an American would truly harm someone simply for speaking freely in the United States of America. And you say, I don't believe that anymore.
Yeah, well, I mean, I feel like an idiot, frankly. I mean, I spent the last decade telling my wife I'd go out to a college campus and she would say, what's the protection like? And I'd say, well, I've got my security there. She'd say, but I want to know how many police officers are there. She's much more cautious than I am. And I'd say, well, enough. And she'd say, well, are you going to wear the bulletproof vest? And I'd say, probably. And she'd say, no, you need to wear the bulletproof vest. I'm like, well, nobody's going to shoot me. I mean, like, what's the worst that's going to happen? Somebody's going to, come up and take a poke at me and my security will tackle them, or somebody will pull a knife and I'm far enough away from the crowd that it won't be a big deal. And because that's really unthinkable, I think. It really is to have to consider the possibility that every time you go out of your house, I mean, forget about public events. This could have happened to Charlie, given the circumstances and the probable nature of the shooter. This could have happened to Charlie walking out of his house in the morning. I mean, this is like a real thing now. I mean, Brett Kavanaugh was nearly assassinated inside his house by somebody who was outside of his house. We're reaching a point in American life where the location isn't even really the consideration. It's the fact that there's an attempt right now to basically say, if you shut up, you will be safe. And if you speak out politically, there's a good shot that some unhinged actor is going to take that as a threat and then come and try and kill you. Yeah, I mean, there will be, I've told my security team, I will never again do an outdoor event. It's not possible because there's too many vantage points. There's too many overlooks. If we'll do indoor events, those indoor events, I'm going to try and mandate as far as possible metal detectors, because it's not like a normal circumstance, going to the grocery store in Florida where a bunch of people are armed. This is like an actual political event. We now know that people are legitimately targeting folks for death at these events. We're going to have to contain the environment an awful lot more. And a lot of the sort of viral nature of the debates, I don't know how it's going to be possible, frankly, to ever again, at least for the foreseeable future, do the kind of thing that Charlie did, where it was like, okay, you get up 3 feet from me and now we have an open debate in an open air setting. I just don't think from a safety and security point of view, that's even remotely possible anymore. That's not going to stop me from, there are rumors going around that I'm not going to do campus anymore, which is absolute nonsense. I'm planning on a wide variety of campuses, and I'm sure that I'm not the only one this year, because if what Charlie died for means anything, it means that we have to keep actually going into these spaces and having these debates. But it's going to change the nature of security, just the same as, when it came to airports, 9/11 changed the nature of security.
Ben, I have to tell you that the second I saw the news, beyond my horror, I just thought about you and your safety and the safety of your family. And I'm thinking about you. For those who have not read Ben's amazing piece, it's called "The Assassination of Charlie Kirk and the Fight for America's Soul." It's up now on the Free Press's website. And Ben's new book is called "Lions and Scavengers: The True Story of America and Her Critics." Ben, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
No, thanks, Barry. Really appreciate it.
I want to bring in next Matt Continetti. Matt is a political columnist here at the Free Press, and he's also the director of domestic policy studies at AEI. The piece just up in the Free Press this morning is excellent. If you haven't read it, please do. It's called "Who Will Stop America's Slide into the Abyss?" Matt, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Barry.
Okay, here's what you write in your piece. And I opened the whole conversation this way because I think it is so powerful and true. "The assassination of Charlie Kirk," you write, "struck at the ties that hold a free society together: open assembly, civil debate, viewpoint diversity. I will add, the very things the Free Press was founded to defend." You write, "Like every terrorist act, the shooting was meant to instill fear. In this case, fear of speaking out, fear of exposure, fear of making a difference." The fact that Kirk, you write, was killed on a college campus is grimly symbolic. One of his gifts was encouraging conservative students to speak out on campus, to stand against the university monoculture, and he paid for that courage with his life. Matt, tell me about what you're thinking the day after this horrific and I think transformative event in American life. The question that you ask in your piece is, who will stop America's slide into the abyss? I'm hoping that you and other wiser people than me have a good answer for that question.
Well, I think like a lot of Americans, Bari, I'm still trying to assimilate what happened yesterday in Utah. The event was just shocking on every level. To have this assassination take place in broad daylight, in public, recorded on video, to have the images and the recordings recycled on social media throughout the afternoon. Charlie's youth continues to disturb me. The fact that he was just 31 years old, married, 2 young children, robbed of a father, a wife robbed of a husband, was shocking. And that it happened to someone who is not an elected official, someone who's simply in the public square, an activist, a very prominent activist, someone who is very prominent on social media, I think makes anyone who has an audience or who uses a public platform or voices an opinion on social media worried that they could be a potential target. What I'm I won't say cheered by, but what I'm proud to see is that most Americans are sharing our shock and dismay. It doesn't matter what political persuasion they are. They are saying how traumatic this event was, how awful it was that Charlie was killed. And I think that is the beginning, perhaps, of a moment where we could turn as a collective, as a group, to think seriously about how we reinforce the structures of democracy that the terrorist took aim at yesterday.
One of the things that is causing me just so much concern is the sort of swirling of the drain that happens after an event like this, where you see unhinged people, in this case on the political left, celebrating the murder, essentially saying this person deserved it. There's, you can go on Blue Sky or Twitter or any social media platform, Instagram, and just see the openness of that position. But then you see the right, or parts of the right, obviously not the right, parts of the right responding, basically, this is war. We are at war. And there's already been it's hard to know exactly what's accurate because it's social media and their clips, but just some really disturbing images of sort of, March for the White Man, things of that nature. And I wonder how you stop that cycle. How do you stop? It's a very, very normal reaction to see people celebrating the death of someone that you admire, agree with, etc., and say, if that's going to be their reaction, it's gloves off for me too. How do we stop that cycle?
I think the first step we need to take is by enforcing the rule of law. And I think that's why it's very important that we capture Charlie Kirk's assassin and we subject him to the full extent of the law under American due process and procedure. We need to show that our society does not stand for this, and that the law and the Constitution, including the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment, which was so dear to Charlie Kirk, still reign in the United States of America. That's, I think, step one. And step two is the center needs to assert itself. We have so many structures in our society that promote the extreme. And what we're finding is that the extreme is meeting. And so the left-wing terrorists can find common cause with the extreme, far anti-Semitic conspiratorial right. Both are targeting our free society. Both are targeting the Constitution of the United States of America. And so for those of us who are in between those extremes, those of us who do believe in America, who believe in free inquiry, who believe in open debate, who believe in the rule of law, and who believe in liberty and equality, we need to have our voices heard. And so that's why it's important that Ezra Klein wrote that column you mentioned earlier in the program. That's why it's important that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says she's not going to hold her events this weekend, and because of Charlie Kirk, in honor of him, that have the two sides come together. And just a note on rhetoric. Rhetoric is not responsible for criminality. But I do think that some of the messages we see on the far left, talking about the white nationalist occupation of the United States, talking about Donald Trump invading states and cities through his exercise of executive power, through this hyperbolic rhetoric about eliminating trans people, that I think does create a culture where radicals begin to think that their survival is at stake. And when your survival is at stake, you begin to believe anything is permitted, and you also begin to dehumanize the other side. So I do think it's important for people in the public square, while they are reaffirming what Charlie Cook stood for, to also approach these questions with deliberation and with a sense of, consequence and thought to what they say in public.
One of the things you quote in your magnificent column today is this interview that the author Cynthia Ozick gave with the Wall Street Journal last weekend. And it's a very short series of 3 sentences, but it made my hair stand on end. What Ozick, who's very wise in addition to being very talented, said is, this is a good country. It's a great country. And now it's disintegrating.
Yeah.
That is a profoundly despairing sentiment. But I think it's one that a lot of people are grappling with and feeling. You continue after you quote her saying that Kirk's death feels like a watershed. You say it's the most stunning evidence we have to date that America is becoming 2 nations divided not only by politics, but by culture, lifestyle, psychology, and even epistemology. In other words, ways of knowing. Weak institutions, corrupted data, rampant distrust, political enmity, and an apparent inability to control criminality and the dangerously mentally ill tear us apart like a centrifugal force. I've been thinking about ways to combat this, and I want to pick up on just what you said about the center asserting itself. I think a lot of times when people hear that, they think of the center as some sort of like soylent position, like an absence of conviction or passion, like the sort of like midpoint between any sort of poles, and in that sense just a neutrality. And I think that one of the things that must be done is to make the center a charismatic force in the way that the fringes right now are a charismatic force.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And what that means is there need to be personalities involved in talking about the center. And the center is not some squishy point that's equidistant between both sides. The center is the belief in the foundational principles of this country, a belief in the Constitution, a belief in free speech, a belief in colorblindness, a belief in an expansive sense of national identity, not based on bloodline, but based on citizenship in the United States. That's what the center is, to take pride in your country, to not see it as a source of evil, which I think many people now on the extremes do see America as. So I think one big change in my thinking is that for a long while, I had thought that we would need a very charismatic leader, a statesman, to guide us through these extremely troubled waters. Now I'm beginning to think that that will not be enough. And of course, extremely capable statesmen are very rare. I think what we need is a collective effort. I think we need a cultural effort in order to combat the madness. And when I saw that line in the interview with Cynthia Ozick, who is in her 90s, over the weekend, it immediately struck me as true. For some time now, I've been thinking that America is slowly dividing. We could talk about political polarization, but when we see states literally rejecting the federal government's authority, when we see a complete misapprehension or a chasm dividing people's attitudes toward the most fundamental questions of sex, of family, of marriage, and of social behavior and conduct, it really boggles the mind about how we can bridge that divide. Now, the classic way America did this was by letting local government and by letting state government really take on much of the authority for their own communities. And so when you devolve power in that way, you don't raise these questions to a national or existential level. So I do think some kind of limiting of the federal government is necessary. But I also know that we live in a world that is global, that is digital, and that if you go online, you are immediately confronted with the most offensive things that may have happened on the other side of the planet. And so I do think that we have to take a hard look as well at the supercomputers we have in our pockets, these phones, and how they may have been an instrument in the radicalization of terrorists like Charlie Kirk's killer, or the killer of Brian Thompson, the United Healthcare CEO.
Matt Continetti, it's always such a pleasure seeing you and talking to you. For those who haven't read it yet, his piece, which I highly recommend, is called "Who Will Stop America's Slide into the Abyss?" And of course, you can catch Matt's writing almost every Monday or Tuesday. I always forget the day. I edit it on Mondays here in the Free Press. Matt, thank you so much.
Thank you, Bari.
I want to bring in now two incredible people who I always learn from, and I'm sure you do too. You're going to know their names. One is Konstantin Kisin, and the other is Catherine Boyle. Konstantin is the host of the Trigonometry podcast, and his book is called An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West. His Substack is his name, Konstantin Kisin. He is joined by the wonderful Catherine Boyle. Catherine is a venture capitalist, a partner at A16Z. She oversees the incredible American Dynamism Project there. And she's also, and I'm very proud of this, a member of the board of the Free Press. Catherine and Konstantin, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having us, Bari.
So, Konstantin, I want to start with you. You wrote something on Twitter that the two of you wrote things on the internet over the past 24 hours that I felt touched me in a deep way beyond just my head, but touched my heart. Konstantin, this is what you wrote on Twitter. "Tonight feels like some sort of invisible line has been crossed that we didn't even know was there. The last time I felt this was 9/11, which is, of course, the anniversary is today, when it was clear without knowing the how and the what that the world was about to change forever. Like the rules of the game had been permanently altered and there was simply no going back to the innocent, peaceful past. I didn't feel like this when an attempt was made on President Trump's life, but you do feel that now. And I want you to explain to people why that is."
Yeah, before I do, I'll just say, it's late here in the UK and I've just finished putting my toddler to bed. And I think of Charlie's kids who are going to bed without their father tonight. It's a very sad moment, I think. And I got lots of messages from people before and after I tweeted that. And I wrote that on my Substack, actually, basically echoing the same point. And I don't necessarily know exactly that I can explain all the details and nuances of why I think that is. But my sense is that violence has entered a new realm. The reason I didn't think that the assassination attempt on President Trump's life had the same effect on me was that I think, sadly, we know that through the history of the United States, that has happened. American presidents have been shot. American presidents have been assassinated. But for this to happen, I think a lot of people felt that Charlie Kirk was just one of them, just a normal person having conversations with people in the Knowledge Campus. And from speaking to my friends in America, many of them not political, many of them normie people, so to speak, offline people, a lot of them just feel like, well, and this may be right or wrong, but it's what they feel, that actually just being a Republican now is a dangerous thing. Just expressing your opinion that's not the left wing or the mainstream opinion is a dangerous thing. And that in and of itself, I think, fundamentally changes the way that we do politics, the way that we do culture, the way that we do conversation. I can only imagine that anyone who is in any position of public prominence now in the US and elsewhere is now thinking every time they open their mouth, are my children going to go to bed tomorrow without me? If I say this thing that I know to be true, I believe to be true, I believe to be important, I believe to be valuable to our public discussion, I don't think we can pretend that that isn't happening. And so the impact that will have, first and foremost, on the expression of people's opinions and the way we conduct the business of politics, I think will be huge. And then, of course, there are all sorts of cascading downstream effects that we can't predict, as there was the case with 9/11. There were all sorts of things that happened because people wanted to make things right, but in the process of it made them even worse or made new things bad or whatever. And I really, really hope that the United States, which is a country I love as a friend of the US, can step back from this brink, because obviously there is the danger, which I hope never materializes, that there are some people on the other side who are as extreme as whoever did this to Charlie, who say, well, if you're going to play if this is how the game is played now, we can play this game as well. I really hope that doesn't happen. I worry about saying that out loud, because I don't want there to be any illusion that that's the way forward. It's not the way forward. That's the way down into hell. But that is the risk, in addition to all sorts of other things that I think inevitably come from an event like this, because we're now in a position where if you're a decent person who's just trying to say what they believe in public, you now have to worry about being killed. And that is not a recipe for a healthy society.
There's one way to see this, KB, which is that the downstream effects of this, and everyone I know is talking about this all day on WhatsApp and Signal and just in our newsroom, is the profound chilling effect that an act of terror like this has. I mean, this is a person that was in a tent, would go to college campuses under a tent, asking people to disagree with him. It is the most American of acts. He is the embodiment of what American freedoms are. The foundation of them is the idea that we can use speech to persuade people and to resolve our differences. And so one idea is that the downstream effects of this are going to be the obvious ones, the chilling effect. What you have been writing about over the past 24 hours on Twitter is a very different sort of downstream effect of it. And I want you to explain it. You wrote on Twitter, one of the things you've written is that a lot of us woke up today with a new mission. And I want you to explain what you mean by that.
Yeah. No, yesterday I said we're entering an era of the martyr. And this is an idea that is not just because of Charlie's assassination. It's something that's been on my mind as a Catholic after the Annunciation shooting of 2 children who became martyrs that day unwittingly. And so it's something I've been reflecting on a lot. And I tweeted, courage is almost a contradiction in terms. It comes from Chesterton's great book, Orthodoxy. It means a strong desire to live taking the form of a willingness to die. And the reason I've been talking so much about martyrdom is just to be perfectly candid. I was in a business meeting when I heard the news about Charlie, and I'm not a personal friend of his. I've met him a few times, but I have just the utmost admiration and respect for him and his project. And when I heard the news, I stepped out and I just went outside and started praying. And the prayer that I prayed was, please, God, do not make this man a martyr. And it just kept saying it over and over and over again. And then, of course, hours later, we found out that indeed he was martyred. And so, I spent some time last night going back through this quote that just came back to me about what is courage? What is this courage of really, truly being this juxtaposition of a zest and something that is so worth living for, the zest for life. You have it so deeply that you are willing to die. And went back into this book, which I would recommend all of your listeners read if you haven't read it. I in some ways, I think Charlie would have been a huge fan of it, and he probably was a huge fan of it. But the juxtaposition, it sort of hit me like a ton of bricks, was he was talking about that there are 2 choices. And it was another quote that I posted today. The choice is between martyrdom, which is, again, living your life to the fullest to the point of willing to die for something outside yourself, and suicide. And when I first read it, I said, well, suicide really doesn't have anything to do with this. But of course, you all have been writing for years about the suicide of the West, about what is happening in this country, what is happening in Western civilization. And there really are 2 choices now. It is the choice of taking on that martyrdom, we have to stand up for what we believe. Even normal people like myself who often use the excuse, I'm not a professional writer or commentator anymore. I don't need to be public in my beliefs about everything because that is not my role. We now have the choice to choose between, are we going to be martyrs for the things that we believe? Are we going to be like Charlie, or are we going to be like those children who were killed for their faith and continue going to our churches and our synagogues and our places of worship, even knowing that we will potentially be killed, our children will be killed in those places? Or are we going to be martyrs for the truth? Are we going to be martyrs for this country? Because the other choice is complacency with suicide. And you know, I was listening to you know, Matthew, who came on and spoke about rhetoric, and I understand, like, there's rhetoric now that's happening on the internet that feels very heightened, but I think that seriousness and that heightenedness is important, that we are having to make these choices. And it might sound extreme to say we have to be martyrs for the things that we believe. But I do believe that what we saw yesterday was a true martyrdom of someone who exemplified the highest order of what that means, which is using words, which is using debate, which is going out and saying what he believes, knowing that there is incredible danger there because he believed in something greater than his own life. And frankly, his own family, which is the thing that you know, is I think tearing on every mother and father who has children that age. Because I think he exemplifies the best of what we are supposed to be called to be doing, which is to be martyrs for God and for country and for truth. And that's why people like me who don't know him are so touched and moved by what happened to him yesterday.
KB, for people that are listening and tuning in, and I know people feel so moved by the words you're sharing, but who think to themselves, I didn't really know Charlie Kirk was. It's horrible that a father and a husband was murdered. He seemed like a good guy, but I don't see myself in what Catherine's saying. I just want things to go back to normal. This is a thing that we hear a lot right now, that, you know, I just want to go about my life. I want things to go back to normal. What's your message to the person that hears the idea of suicidal civilization or martyrdom and thinks, I don't see myself in that? I want you to speak, if you can, to that person who sees themselves as a normie that has a lot going on in their life.
Yeah, I mean, and I sympathize with them, right? Because my job is not what you all do. But I think the important thing is that, you know, as I said, I woke up with a new mission. I feel called to be much more vocal because I have friends like you and people who are putting themselves out there day in, day out. And there is not only safety in numbers, but the way that we achieve normalcy in this country and the way that we go back to the era that we all look at and say, wow, we could raise our kids without fearing for their lives, or we could go to church without seeing an armed police officer, or go to our synagogue without having to worry about having private security. The way that we get back to that is speaking up. It's doing exactly what Charlie did. And of course, he practiced martyrdom in the most extreme way, which hopefully none of us will ever have to experience, but we can practice it in small ways every day in our university classrooms where we say what we're thinking, or we can do it with our business associates. We can say the thing that we're actually thinking. And I think that's what we are called to do it in a way of practicing martyrdom every day, where yes, we will possibly lose some things, possibly lose some friends, but that's how we get back to that normalcy that everyone is craving and the America that people all want to get back to. So I'm committing myself to do that in small ways, not in the way that Charlie did, but in the small ways. And I hope I never am in a circumstance where that happens to me, right? But in the small ways where I know that I'm going to be sacrificing, but it's for this greater good, getting back to exactly what you just said.
Constantine, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I wish I felt that there was some sort of way of going back to. There's no going back to anything. You can't move back. You can only move forward. And we do not get to choose the times that we live in. And the times we live in are what they are. I wouldn't even put a label on it at this point. They just are what they are. We do not live in the age of normalcy. We live in the age of extremism. That's just a fact. And so we're going to have to reckon with that and act accordingly. Now, one of the things that I think is clearly, I don't know if you talked about this with Matthew when you were talking about rhetoric, because I jumped on fairly late, but we have to recognize that quite a lot of us, even though we've been willing to say something, we've nonetheless been very careful to not challenge some very, very important and very false claims about reality that have been being made for a long time. And one of them is this idea about words being violence, which we heard initially. Then we heard that silence was violence during the summer of BLM. And all of these things are being called violence, which are not violence. And the reason this really matters, Bari, is that once you say words are violence, or once you say that silence is violence, well, historically speaking, our understanding of violence is that if you are violent towards me, I'm entitled to be violent back towards you. So if we allow these realities to be rewritten in this linguistic way, we end up in a place where, let's be honest, if you look at the polling of Gen Z in particular, there's quite a lot of people. I mean, we've lost a good chunk of a generation to a mind virus that tells them that actually it's okay if you're upset about big pharma or insurance company CEOs. It's actually, if someone goes and murders one of them, that's actually a good thing. Let's celebrate that person. And on it goes. So there's a re-education project that needs to happen in America and across the West. And it starts with our own children. It starts with us taking parent responsibility as parents for reminding and very powerfully reinstating the key messages and distinctions of Western civilization. And one of them is that there is a big difference between words and violence. And just because your feelings are hurt, or just because someone has a different political opinion to you, you're not entitled to punch people you wrongly label as Nazis. We lived through that era. And if there's one hope I have for this tragedy, is that the result of it is we simultaneously stop taking this nonsense seriously, and also take it so seriously that we actually begin to address these lies in a very powerful and profound way. And this has to be the moment when we all say, enough of your bullshit. Words are not violence. Silence is not violence. Violence is violence, and it's completely unacceptable, and it has to end. But that, I think, is a generational project, because, as I say, we have been miseducating our young people for a long time, and the circumstances of their life are more challenging with the rise of social media, with the rise of atomization, with the rise of, powerful economic currents that affect people's lives. And that is a fight we're going to have to win. But to win it, we're going to have to fight it properly first.
One thing I want to pick up on here, and I'm curious your both of your answers to this, is what Constantine is saying about us living in the era of extremes. I don't think the extremes are the majority, but I think the extremes feel like the most generative and sort of alive place right now. I think that is certainly true culturally and politically. And I think one of the things Matt mentioned earlier in this conversation is this idea of sort of like bringing back the center. And I think most people hear the center and they think like they think like an absence of passion. They think about like a negative identity that is the opposite of what the extremes are offering right now, which is profound charisma and power. And I wonder, Catherine, and I hear a little bit of what you're saying. I know you would never phrase it as bringing back the center, but speaking up for what used to be called common sense and normalcy, decency, civility, the things that we used to think of as water, we didn't even notice it until it went away. How can we, and whatever language you want, how can we make that charismatic? Because that is the thing that I think is essential if the extremes are going to be, if the extremes are not going to become the mainstream.
Yeah. Well, the irony of, I think, the murder of Charlie is that he was not the extreme. Mm-hmm. He was representative of exactly what you were talking about. And he was the right-wing version of that. But he went on college campuses and he debated in a way that in some ways looks very twee. Like you don't see photos of Charlie Kirk around the internet holding machine guns and threatening violence. He was the man who went to campus and would talk to anyone. So he is an example. And it's the thing about what's so horrific about Martyrs is, a lot of the tweets that are going around about, his view is someone asked him, what do you want to be remembered for? And he said, I want to be remembered for my faith. I want to be remembered for my faith in Jesus Christ. And I always point out that Jesus Christ never picked up the sword. And a lot of people will feel called to anger and violence in Charlie's name, just as some people feel that way in Jesus's name. But the point of martyrdom and the point of I think what his project stood for is it did not stand for violence. It stood for debate. It stood for dialogue. And so I think in some ways the extremes, if they are looking for a cause, it is the opposite of what his cause was, which was to engage with one another, to have proper dialogue, to have dissent, to meet your enemies, right? And to not even think of them as enemies, to think of them as people you can convert to your cause. And I think that's a very important part of this, is that we cannot call people who are on the left or the right extremists when they are part of what the center is, which is speaking, which is debating, as Constantine said. It's putting your voice out there, but it is not taking up arms. It is not violence. It is not silencing the other side's view, because that would mean that Charlie died in vain, and we cannot have that.
I think one of the things that's just so disorienting is that for those familiar with the kinds of things Charlie Kirk did, he's just about the most mainstream conservative, magnanimous conservative that you would ever hope to encounter. And yet there is just a chasm between the reality of who he was and the way that he's being talked about on certain cable networks who I don't even need to name. And that is enraging to many people because it creates what Ben opened this conversation with talking about, which is a sort of permission structure in which violence is acceptable against people who sort of fall so well outside the Overton window of what's normal in American cultural and political life, when he was so deeply inside what has always been considered the 40-yard lines. Constantine, I want to just bring in a little bit of news, which is that as we're having a discussion, the Wall Street Journal put out a photo of the person of interest in the shooting. It was already going around online, but it's now official, and the FBI is offering a reward of up to $100,000 for any information. As you both know, but as people just tuning in will want to know, a high-powered rifle, including ammunition engraved with transgender and anti-fascist ideology. CNN, I believe, described it as cultural slogans, which was incredible, was recovered in a wooded area where the shooter fled. I wonder if there's anything that either of you want to say about, I mean, there's a way of seeing this, which is, you know, there's political extremists and violence on both sides. That is always true. Many people are mentally ill. Many people in a country awash in guns can pick up guns and kill other people. But there's a specificity to this ideology, which, if true, also drove the shooter at the Annunciation Church, at the Mass that Catherine was talking about. And if I think back even to 5 or 6 years ago, there was this trope that Antifa wasn't really a thing. It was some kind of imagined construct, that Antifa was actually the same thing as our, you know, great grandparents who went and fought the Nazis. They're simply anti-fascist. And who has a trouble with anti-fascist? Constantine, I wonder if you want to comment on that.
Well, it comes back to what I said, which is we have to stop pretending that when people say ridiculous things, those things are acceptable to discuss. The things that have happened to the words Nazi, fascist over the last decade disgust me more than almost anything else that this woke progressive extremism has done. Because I've been saying this for many, many years, Bari, as you know. If you truly believed, you're a person of passion and principle. If I truly believed, if Catherine truly believed that Hitler was here and about to take over the United States government or the British government, would it not be our duty to pick up a rifle and go to the front line? So when we allowed these people to use words like Nazi and fascist, and when I say we, I don't just mean me, you, and the three of us, I mean our culture. When we didn't say in shock and horror, how dare you? How dare you call somebody a Nazi? I mean, we have this in Britain. David Lammy, who was until recently our foreign secretary and is now the deputy prime minister of this country, he's repeatedly called people in British conservative movements Nazis. We just had a former Labour politician just accuse Nigel Farage of being like Adolf Hitler, right? When you have this type of rhetoric, there will be people who are, of course, tempted to take that literally. Some people will be mentally ill and that will be their cover. But my point is, we have allowed these terms and these labels to be used with such careless abandon that I think we've become completely desensitized to just how inaccurate, horrific, and unacceptable these claims are. And so when you have CNN or MSNBC or left-wing publications in Britain allowing this type of thing and not challenging people who say these sorts of things, I think that inevitably contributes to a climate when people who are labeled as such will be killed.
Yeah, I so agree with what you just said, Constantine. And the thing that I think you said earlier about we can't go back to normalcy is that the reason why things got so bad is because normal people who just wanted to keep their head down ignored it. They said, okay, I'm not going to question it. I just want things to be normal. I'm just going to, you know, sit there and take it. I'll do whatever is asked of me at work. I'll change my LinkedIn. I'll put my pronouns up. I'll do whatever, even if we didn't believe in it. And I think we have now seen the consequences of not taking a stand as normal people. And so that, I think, is the call, is that now all of us have to call that out, to say that yes, rhetoric and words have power. And if we hear someone using words incorrectly, we have to debate them. We have to tell them that they are wrong, and we can no longer be silent.
Catherine Boyle, Konstantin Kisin, thank you so much for joining me on a really emotional day. It's really wonderful to see two friends. Thank you. I want to now bring in Senator Mark Kelly. Mark is, of course, no stranger to political violence. His wife, as everyone knows, Congresswoman Gabby Giffords, was a survivor of horrific political violence in 2011 when she was shot in the head outside of a grocery store in Arizona, and thank God survived. Senator Kelly, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me on, Bari.
I want to start just by asking what your initial reaction was yesterday, your emotional reaction when the news broke that Charlie Kirk had been shot at Utah.
Well, I think like so many other Americans, I was horrified. I was here in this office, my office in Washington, D.C., my Senate office, meeting with somebody talking about cancer. And my staff tells me that Charlie Kirk has been shot. And, you know, much like when Gabby was shot, my initial reaction, you know, was, well, he'll probably be okay. You know, with Gabby, that was the first phone call. The second phone call, I learned she was shot in the head. And it kind of brought me back to that day. And I immediately started thinking about Charlie's wife, his kids, his siblings, his parents, and what they're going through, you know, at this point. And, you know, it's very visceral and it's, you know, very real. And I know the pain that they have felt. Now, Gabby survived. And Charlie didn't. I didn't know Charlie. I didn't know his wife's name, you know, yesterday. I do now. But that family this is decades. I mean, this is the rest of their lives that they're going to be affected by what happened with a guy who decided to show up there and commit this horrendous act of political violence.
Gabby was shot 14 years ago. I cannot believe it's been 14 years. And our country has become a place where gun violence, but specifically politically motivated violence, has become more and more normal. When a historian comes and writes the story of the past 14 years, how will they explain how this happened?
Well, first of all, Bari, I don't think any of us should accept that it's normal. It's not. I think it's fair to say it's more common. And it's happened a lot recently. Gabby's shooting was 14 years ago. I think historians are not going to judge us well. Your previous guest, you know, said rhetoric and words have power. They do. I think that's part of this. I also think historians are going to have to figure out what the hell happened. Like, how did we get to this point? I don't think we completely understand, you know, why we are here, why we are so divided and polarized as a country. I will say this: we've got to figure out a way to bring, you know, both sides together. I was just at a bipartisan barbecue lunch with my Republican colleagues, and one of my Republican Senate colleagues was just so shooken up when she asked me about how Gabby is doing, and she started tearing up because she knows how this impacts her. You know, Gabby saw the, you know, video of Charlie getting shot. And I'd say more than, you know, most of these, this one does seem to have has had a big effect on her.
What did she say? What did she said to you?
She was just how awful. You know, she's got aphasia, so she's got a challenge, you know, with language because of the traumatic brain injury she suffered that day. But she just said, you know, this is messed up. And this is awful. And I could just hear it in her voice about how devastated she was, and to see this and to know that yet again in our country, in our democratic process, somebody decided to show up with a gun and tried to, you know, murder, you know, Charlie Kirk, but it's also an assault on our democracy. At the same time, that's why people do this. It's certainly, to some extent, it's about the individual, but it's also about our process. And it weakens us collectively. We become weaker as a nation when these things happen, whether it's the shooting in Minnesota a couple months ago to Melissa Hortman, who Gabby knew, by the way, knew her fairly well, to the murder of Charlie Kirk yesterday.
Senator, you said in an interview yesterday that this type of political violence in our country is just too common. Common's a better word than normal. I agree with you. And it has to end. You also said on MSNBC a few hours ago that people in positions of power and influence need to consider how much weight their words carry and need to dial down the rhetoric. I want to ask you, how do we end it? And who or what are you thinking of when you are talking about political rhetoric that needs to be dialed down?
Well, I mean, I'm only out there policing myself, right? I try to be very thoughtful about whether I'm, speaking about the president of the United States, my Republican colleagues, my Democratic colleagues, and I realize there's a line and that you shouldn't go over this line. And the reason is because people listen to what we say. They listen to what you say. They listen to the commentators on Fox News and CNN and MSNBC. Their words carry tremendous weight. So you have to, in this job, you have to recognize that. And I've seen my colleagues say things that I would never say. Democrats and Republicans, Senate members of the Senate and the House and governors and the president. And so I think at a moment like this, when we are this divided, and I think it's fair to say we have had this increasing amount of political violence, I think it's on all of us, folks that, serve in the media, to just kind of reevaluate, yourself. Little introspection here to say, hey, am I being completely fair here about, how I'm characterizing, folks on the other side of the political spectrum. We should have disagreements, by the way. We have a two-party system. It's good to have two parties. We sort of keep each other in check. We can have debate and open disagreements. So one thing, I didn't agree with Charlie Kirk on much.
Yeah.
But I will tell you this, I totally agree with his right to be out there. And I got to give him a lot of credit, going into places where people disagree with him and actually having a debate over issues. You don't see that a lot. And I will defend, his rights, and others, their right to do this.
How do you understand those on mostly the far left, but some in the mainstream left, sort of justifying Charlie Kirk's death? One of the common things that's being trotted out there is something that Charlie Kirk said in defending the Second Amendment, talking about how some gun deaths are unfortunately worth it to keep the Second Amendment. And this has led people to say he had it coming. He's sort of sowing what he reaped. This is the world he wanted to live in. And that goes all the way to the much further extreme, which is people just out and out being gleeful at his death. How do you explain a culture that is allowing for that?
Well, that's really messed up. And there are a lot of assholes out there. That'll just say ridiculous things that, they shouldn't say it. And if they say it, it should be something, they keep in private. They don't put out there publicly, but it's just messed up, and it's ridiculous, and it's awful. Nobody deserves what happened to Charlie Kirk yesterday. Nobody deserves that.
What do you say to people, other public figures, commentators, just ordinary Americans who see what just happened to this person and think, I'm going to go away. I am not going to speak my mind or engage in public debate because look at what they just did to Charlie Kirk?
Well, that's the risk. When people recede from participating in our democratic process, we are just weaker as a country. To see all those mostly students, I imagine yesterday, but I saw some people in interviews that clearly weren't students that went there for that event. To see all those folks having a discussion, I'm sure many of them agreed with Charlie Kirk, but there were others there that didn't. And that's a good thing for our democracy to have them out there having this discussion. But how many of those folks, from yesterday, are not going to show up to something like that again? I imagine a lot of them will be, they'll recede. Maybe they, say screw it and they don't vote anymore. We are a stronger country when we have more people involved in the political process and we have more people vote. That strengthens our democracy. What happened to Charlie Kirk yesterday weakens it.
Senator Mark Kelly, thank you so much for making the time for me today. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me on.
Next, I want to bring in Eli Lake, Maya Sulkin. Eli Lake, of course, is a writer at the Free Press and the host of Breaking History. And whenever Maya's tech allows for it, yay, it did. And Maya is a reporter at the Free Press. Guys, thank you so much for joining me.
It's great to be here, Bari.
Thanks for having me.
I just want to start with your initial reactions. What did you feel yesterday when you heard that Charlie Kirk had been shot? Maya, let's start with you.
I was right here at the office, and I was really totally, completely shaken. And the first place I actually went was to Hassan Piker's live stream before I went on X or anywhere else. And he, is a Gen Z streamer famous for being a terrorist apologist, and he was speechless. But in between looking at those reactions, I tried to read about who Charlie was off camera, and the people that knew him off camera made it very clear that we lost an incredibly gracious, faithful powerhouse with a really strong belief in the American project. And it's really an incredible loss. And like Constantine said, it feels like a big watershed moment.
Eli, how about you?
I felt like I was living through like the period of the assassinations in some ways. Charlie Kirk is not, a politician, but he is a national political figure. He's certainly one of the major influencers who helped get Trump elected. He speaks for millions of people in the MAGA movement, particularly young people. And this was the assassin's veto, and it's a horrible kind of thing to contemplate. Is this our new reality? And this is how republics unravel when violence sort of takes the place of debate. And that is the one thing we can say about Charlie Kirk, is that was a core part of what his mission was, is that he would go on these college campuses and ask the most radical students to debate him. And to have him gunned down in the prime of his life in the middle of that process is just horrifying.
Charlie Kirk's murder, did not happen in isolation. This is part of a growing trend toward political violence that we've written so much about at the Free Press, and that Eli, you've done some incredible podcasts about. I'm thinking most obviously the plots against Gretchen Whitmer and Brett Kavanaugh, the attack on Paul Pelosi in his home, 2 assassination attempts against President Donald Trump, one of which was unbelievably, miraculously close, the murders of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson and Minnesota lawmaker Melissa Hortman, the murders of Israeli embassy staff Yaron Lashinsky and Sarah Milgram outside that museum in DC, and there are many, many, many others. Eli, when the story is told, what will the story be of how we've arrived at this moment? There have been times of more regular violence. You think about the late 60s and early 70s with groups like the Weather Underground and others. So there was more then, but this feels sort of different. And I want you to explain both how we got here, if you can, but also why it feels significantly different.
Well, I think that in one sense, there is a connection to the existential rhetoric. And I hate to both sides it, because this has been directed at somebody who's on the right. And I think we should start by saying that if you start in 2016 by saying that the future president, now twice, Donald Trump, is a Nazi, a fascist, is the end of the republic, those are raising the rhetorical stakes. Most people who say that are not going to move into violence, but there are plenty that there's going to be, even if you have a small number of people who think that, then that is a part of it. I think there's also been a similar kind of raising of hyperbolic, raising the stakes rhetoric on the right against the left. And we saw it a little bit in the aftermath of this. I mean, we don't even know who the suspect is at this point. We don't know if they're connected to a group. We don't really have clarity on, what was going in that, whether this person was just mentally ill or what this was about. And we're already seeing a number of these tweets is like, they are coming after us. Who's the they? And that does create a situation where you just have a sort of series of escalations from warring tribes. And after a certain point, we don't have a republic anymore. Hopefully that doesn't happen. Now, we can take some solace because we had a lot of political violence in the 1970s, and it kind of petered out in the early 80s with the attempted assassination of President Reagan and the Pope. And then we had this great period where it really wasn't something that people thought about. So I don't know the answers to sort of how we get back to that cycle where it's not really something that's in our politics. But right now, it feels like we're clearly in it, and it's terrifying.
One of the things that I find sort of most alarming, and I do think it's somewhat of a generational divide, is if you look at a lot of, every living president has put out a statement about this. If you look at the New York Times today, even their most liberal columnists are condemning this horrific violence. I recommended Ezra Klein's column earlier in this conversation, and I will recommend it again. So it feels like sort of above a certain age, there's a viewpoint shared by pretty much everyone that this is absolutely unacceptable. It's like the younger you get, the more acceptable political violence seems to be. And Maya, I wonder if you can speak to that because, Eli and I are old compared to you. You're of that generation and you're online. What are you seeing and what are young people saying?
I first want to start by saying that, our algorithms don't favor the kind of normal centrist posts. So I've seen messages from unexpected people mourning Charlie and praising his legacy. But what has been so troubling is the comments in reaction to those posts. So there are students at, UT Austin saying, the shooter did us a favor. I would have killed him myself. Someone had to do it. He's a disgusting person with disgusting beliefs. I mean, we saw what happened after Brian Thompson, after Wesley LePatner. None of this is surprising. FIRE just released a survey and it says 34% of college students think it's acceptable to use violence to stop someone from speaking on a college campus. And so I don't want to fearmonger, but it is no longer just people on the fringes of the internet or on Reddit calling for things like this. At Yale last week, there was a debate on whether political violence was a just means to an end, and that vote passed. This is happening in elite institutions. It is not just on Reddit. And it is, of course, with young people, exactly like you're saying.
Eli, Charles Layman, who's a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, wrote in our pages after the murder of Brian Thompson. He said this: the political violence of the 60s and 70s wasn't ended by revolution. It was ended by the National Guard and the FBI's targeting of far left groups. What do you think we can expect from this White House in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's murder?
I would dissent from that. I think it was COINTELPRO was not great, and I think in some ways its overreach probably fed the sense of victimization for some of these domestic radicals. But let's leave that aside. I'm thinking there's an anecdote that's a political violence anecdote from 1972. George Wallace, the segregationist, who was one of the holdouts in this era of great change, was nearly murdered. And in the hospital, the first Black woman to serve in Congress, Shirley Chisholm, visits him, and they form a friendship after that. And over time, because of that friendship, the leader of the segregationists, of the old racist guard, changed his views. And by the end of his life, he said he was wrong about his kind of famous, speeches when he was the governor of Alabama, saying segregation now, segregation forever. I would hope that there are moments like that of grace that we can maybe learn here. And I think that Charlie Kirk in some ways embodied that. He relished debates with people that he disagreed with. He was about to, I think, debate Hassan Piker. He took on
September 25th. Yeah.
At Dartmouth
Right.
in 3 weeks.
Right. That would have, I mean, in some ways, I just want to, that's the one thing that I kind of am holding out for a little bit, which is the idea that maybe there is an opportunity in tragedy for some people who are kind of in this to think, wait a second, the other side is more human. And the thing about political violence is that everybody sort of, all of us would here agree that political violence is bad. You should settle this through the political process. But there, of course, are going to be times in history when you would favor. I'm on Bonhoeffer's side when it comes to assassinating Hitler. And the problem is when you are fed a steady stream of kind of doom scroll information that makes you think we're living in Weimar Republic Germany, which we're not. And it's important. And that's really where our side, as the people who are sense makers and in the media and journalists, we kind of have to, even though there is, as you pointed out, Maya, incredible incentives for extremist kind of, pseudo journalism to paint things in this extreme on both sides. It's very important to kind of try to resist that and to try to see the humanity in people that we disagree with.
Our colleague Peter Savodnik tweeted our colleague Peter Savodnik, who I wanted to join but can't join because of technical issues, we'll have him on a future live stream, said this on Twitter: "This is horrifying, not simply because he was shot, but because we all know or suspect that a growing number of Americans have come around to the belief that violence is permissible and even commendable when it comes to resolving political differences." Maya, for the people that you follow and really that you went to college with and know that ascribe to that view, what's the way back from the brink for those people?
I spoke on the phone with people who, in the wake of Wesley LePatner's murder, the Blackstone CEO, were celebrating that. And when I got on the phone with them, the consistent thing was that they viewed her as a symbol of something they hated. And in doing the eerie video of Charlie that keeps resurfacing online, where he basically says, "The reason I do this is because when people stop talking, civil war ensues and violence starts." And so I've been sharing that as much as I can. And I honestly think it's twofold. The way to change that kind of radicalism is to, frankly, shame people. Those people used to have always existed who celebrate evil things, but they were not mainstream, and they are becoming mainstream. I think of someone like Kalani James at Columbia, who is meant to be expelled, who is tweeting today that he wants more fascists to die. He should be expelled. And it's really a watershed moment for the American center. And by center, I mean people who, regardless of who they voted for, can decipher between good and evil, and who believe, like Charlie Kirk did, in this country and that it's in its values and that they're worth defending.
Eli, anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that is just absolutely driving me crazy is that I'm already noticing on social media that you're seeing like millions of people and tons of engagement for posts that are baseless, that are saying he was assassinated by Israel, which doesn't make any sense to me because Charlie Kirk was one of the most staunchly pro-Israel voices in that MAGA space. But I mean, I'm just kind of amazed that these are getting millions of tweets and it's not just fringe people. And I don't know. My concern is that it's only a matter of time before Tucker goes there, and we'll see this become a kind of a theory. And like, how do you argue with it? It's not based on evidence or anything. We don't know anything yet. So,
Eli Lake, Maya Sulkin, thank you so much for joining me today, and we'll look forward to the next pieces and podcasts that you both put out.
Thank you, Bari.
Thank you all so much for joining me for this conversation. Thanks to Ben Shapiro, Matt Cottonetti, Constantine Kissin, Catherine Boyle, and of course, our own Maya Sulkin and Eli Lake. It's really a pleasure to be with you to the extent that I'm with you, even though I'm behind a screen on a day like today. I really value this incredible community and look for more pieces on Charlie Kirk and rising political violence in America and how we step back from the brink in the days to come.